9th of April, 1968. The world's largest roll-on, roll-off ferry, TEV Wahine, departs from Littleton at 8:40 p.m, bound for Wellington. Little did the crew and passengers know they were sailing towards one of the worst storms in New Zealand history. Wahine reaches the Wellington harbour entrance at 5:50 a.m, and despite the rough conditions and low visibility, Captain H.G. Robertson decides to enter. As Wahine entered the narrow harbour entrance, winds were blowing at over 50 knots. A huge wave slammed into the hull, knocking the radar out of commission, as well as many passengers off their feet. Winds soon increased to over 100 knots, or 185 kilometers per hour. Wahine was fighting hard against the wind, but was losing the battle as she was pushed towards Barrett Reef on the western side of the harbour. For 40 minutes, Wahine battled the wind and waves, but Captain Robertson decided to go back into the Cook Strait. At 6:35 a.m, Captain Robertson orders the engines full astern. He wasn't aware that they were right on top of Barrett Reef, and at 6:40, Wahine hits the reef below the water, tearing off her starboard propeller. All engines soon fail, and Captain Robertson orders all watertight doors to be closed. The wind pushes Wahine forward, dragging her hull along the reef, causing an immense amount of water to flood into the ship and rendering the watertight compartments useless. A distress signal was sent to Beacon Hill, and passengers were notified of the situation and told to prepare emergency equipment. Anchors were dropped in an attempt to stop the ship from dragging along the reef, but the damage was done. 4 watertight compartments were flooding, along with the vehicle deck. The ship had taken on a strong list to starboard, as Wahine continues drifting towards Point Dorset. Despite being so close to shore, the weather conditions made it nearly impossible to rescue the passengers on board. The tugboat Tapui sets off from Queen's Wharf and arrives at the scene by 11 o'clock. By 11:50, Tapui had secured a rope to Wahine and tried to pull her off the reef, but the line quickly gave way and any attempts to secure a line of rope failed. Shortly after 12 o'clock, the Wellington Harbour pilot, Captain Galloway, managed to climb aboard Wahine despite rough conditions, jumping onto a rope ladder hanging off the starboard side. At 1:15 p.m, the starboard list had worsened to around 25 degrees, making the lifeboats on the port side useless. At 1:20, the order to abandon ship was finally given. Captain Robertson was hesitant to give this call due to the weather. He felt it was safer on board than in a lifeboat. Passengers who had been unaware of the true scale of the situation were now panicking and sliding across the sloping deck to get into the lifeboats. Some passengers had taken off their life vests during the morning to use as pillows. Some were directed to the higher port side of the ship, but due to the list, it was now impossible to launch lifeboats from that side. Only 4 of the starboard lifeboats could be launched, so crewmen tried to fill them as much as possible. One lifeboat was swamped shortly after leaving the sinking ship, and its occupants were tossed into the sea. 2 of the other lifeboats safely reached Seatoon. The other landed across the harbour at Eastbourne. Any other passengers were forced to jump into the cold, churning sea. Some clung on to inflatable life rafts that had been thrown overboard, but a number of these were punctured by the wreckage or flipped over by the rough seas. At around 2:30, the now abandoned Wahine capsized in just 11.6 metres of water east of Steeple Rock. By this time, the first survivors were reaching the shores of Seatoon. Many other vessels came to the Wahine's aid, including the Wellington Picton ferry Aramoana, which stood by to pick up survivors. Many survivors were blown to the rocky shores of Eastbourne across the harbour. Rescue teams heading to Eastbourne found the roads blocked by slips, and eventually 200 survivors made it to shore. But the nightmare wasn't over yet. Many were pulled back out to sea by the huge waves, or thrown against the rocks. Robertson and Galloway were the last to leave the ship, and spent an hour in the water before being rescued. 51 people died directly from the disaster, but a further 2 died from their injuries, leaving the total death toll at 53.